The Galactic Union had a rule: never engage the humans. They called it a containment protocol. They thought we were prisoners of our own planet. They were wrong. We weren't prisoners. We were a dormant apex predator, and they just rang the dinner bell. To the High Council of the Tri-System, Earth was not a threat. It was a statistical anomaly, a low-gravity, high-oxygen death trap populated by an energetic, confused species that spent more time fighting itself than looking at the stars. Their archives labeled us Class 3 biological hazards, not because of our technology, but because of our sheer inexplicable unpredictability. They didn't hate us. They were bored by us. We were a curiosity on the edge of a sector they deemed strategically insignificant. Then came the resource famine. The Union needed deuterium, and our sun was sitting on a reserve that was, in their estimation, wasted on us. The decision was made over a meal that lasted less time than it takes for a human to blink. There was no declaration of war, there was no ultimatum. There was simply a logistical adjustment. Pacify and harvest, the High Admiral had said, his voice as thin and sharp as a scalpel. He didn't even look at the tactical scan of our planetary defense systems. Why would he? He was looking at a map of his own supply lines. He assumed they were walking into a graveyard. They landed in the heart of the Pacific. They expected a surrender before their atmospheric thrusters even cooled. They expected terrified primitives fleeing in the face of their chrome hulls and energy suppression fields. Instead, they found silence. The first detachment of Union scouts didn't encounter a planetary army. They encountered a group of construction workers in a port city who, upon seeing a mile-long alien vessel descend, didn't run. They simply stopped what they were doing, looked at their foreman, and realized their shift was officially over, permanently. They are unresponsive, the scout report had stated, a hint of confusion breaking the Admiral's icy composure. They aren't fighting. They're just staring. He didn't understand. We weren't staring. We were calculating. We were remembering. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the dormant gene markers of a species that had survived ice, plague, and starvation finally flickered to life. They wanted resources. They had no idea they had just walked into the center of a predator's den. The silence didn't last. It never does. Violence, like a tide, is inevitable when you kick a hornet's nest. The High Admiral had been wrong, and he knew it. He knew it because his scout detachment had stopped broadcasting. There had been no explosion, no desperate plea for extraction. Just a sudden clean cut in the data stream. Like someone had simply turned off a light. He didn't order a retreat. That would have been logical. Instead, he ordered a full-scale orbital strike on the port city. If the primitives wouldn't fight, he would simply remove the terrain they occupied. It was a standard procedure, written in the annals of 1,000 successful conquests. He expected a crater. He received a message instead. It was a broadcast, not on any frequency the Union utilized, but on an ancient baseband signal they hadn't even bothered to monitor. It was a loop of a single human voice, calm and unhurried. "You have made a tactical error." The escalation was immediate. The Union's heavy hitters, the Dreadnought-class cruisers, dropped out of warp, their shadow blotting out the sun. Their weapon systems were calibrated to shatter continents. They began their approach, preparing to turn the entire hemisphere into molten glass. But humanity hadn't been idle. We thought we were fighting a broken species. We thought their silence was defeat. We were wrong. Their silence was preparation. While the Union had been playing with their supply lines, human engineers had been reverse engineering the scout ship's power core. It was a death sentence to try, but when your planet is on the clock, fear becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. They didn't just understand the tech. They broke it, modified it, and integrated it into our own crude satellite arrays. They didn't just build a shield, they built a trap. As the dreadnoughts entered the upper atmosphere, the sky turned not to fire, but to electricity. The planetary grid, our secret desperate gamble, surged. It wasn't designed to destroy the ships. It was designed to force them into a stalemate. It ionized the atmosphere, creating a localized field that drained the Union's shields and forced their ships to drop to subsonic atmospheric flight. Suddenly, the gods of the sky were vulnerable. Suddenly, the fight was ours. In the heart of what remained of the city, in a bunker buried deep beneath the ruined docks, Lena Soreth sat with her back against the reinforced concrete wall. The air tasted of ozone and dry earth. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of Union ground support craft searching the ruins above. Next to her, Kyle, her tactical lead, was rummaging through a supply pack that had seen better days. He pulled out a small metallic tin. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the raw, buzzing adrenaline that had defined the last 72 hours. "Kyle," Lena said, her voice raspy, "we have 20 minutes until the next sweep. Focus." "I am focused, Lena," he replied, and he pried the lid of the tin open. The scent hit her instantly. It was sweet, cloying, and utterly insane. A preserved, pre-war synthetic fruit tart. Lena stared at it. It was the most absurd thing she had ever seen. The ships outside were dropping fire on her city, and here, in the dark, they were contemplating dessert. Kyle broke a piece off and held it out to her. "It's not going to make the aliens go away. It's not going to fix the comms grid." He looked her in the eye, his face smudged with soot, his expression deadly serious. "But it is a fruit tart, and we are still here." Lena took the piece. The sugar dissolved on her tongue, an achingly human sensation in a world that was rapidly becoming alien. It was a small, fragile, and absolutely defiant act. To sit in the dark, under the gaze of an empire that wanted to wipe them out, and to choose to taste something sweet. "They don't understand us," she whispered, the tart gone. "They think we're fighting for territory. They think we're fighting for the resources in our sun." Kyle closed the tin and tucked it away. "They don't realize that for us, this isn't a war of survival. It's a war of inconvenience." That was the turning point, the realization that they weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting a mindset that viewed humanity as something to be managed. And humans, by their very nature, were unmanageable. Outside, the Union ground support craft hummed, their sensors hunting for heat signatures. They were looking for soldiers. They were looking for an army. They weren't looking for a species that would take the time to eat a tart while planning their destruction. The High Admiral was no longer bored. He was no longer frustrated. He was something he hadn't been in 3 centuries, confused. His logs showed total compliance with the planetary bombardment protocols. Every kinetic strike, every thermal discharge had been executed with perfect precision. Yet the human response remained erratic, discordant, and infuriatingly effective. They didn't retreat in an organized fashion. They disappeared into the ruins, only to strike from angles that defied his tactical projections. They weren't fighting like a nation. They were fighting like a nervous system. "They are not the strongest," the Admiral muttered to his senior advisor, his gaze fixed on the glowing blue sphere of Earth on his bridge display. "They are not the fastest. But they are becoming a system. If we do not sever the core, we will be bled dry by 1,000 tiny cuts." The Council authorized the deployment of the psionic anchor. It was a weapon of psychological architecture, a device that didn't destroy structures, but mapped the collective frequency of a sentient species and amplified their deepest, most destructive insecurities until they broke from within. It had worked on a dozen other worlds. It turned soldiers against their commanders. It turned citizens against their neighbors. It turned hope into a leaden weight of despair. The dreadnoughts moved into high orbit, their massive hulls glowing with the discordant hum of the anchor. As the device activated, the sky didn't shatter. The air simply grew heavy. The silence returned to the city, but this time it was a silence of profound, crushing weight. It was the frequency of "it is useless to continue." In the bunker, Lena felt it first. It wasn't a physical sensation, it was a thought, unbidden and cold, sliding into her mind. "Why are you here, Lena? You're going to die in this dirt. No one knows, no one cares, and the stars will keep turning when your heart stops beating." She looked at Kyle. He was staring at his hands, the metallic tin from earlier forgotten on the floor. His shoulders were slumped. The light in his eyes, the fierce burning intensity that had guided them through the last few days, was dimming. The Union was succeeding. They were peeling back the layers of human resolve, targeting the solitary, shivering ego at the center of every human life. "Lena," Kyle whispered, his voice cracking, "is it even worth it?" They're, they're everywhere. The council is gone. The military is fragmented. We're just ghosts in a graveyard. The anchor pressed harder. It was a tidal wave of existential dread, a whisper of absolute futility. It targeted the human desire for meaning and twisted it into the bitter taste of meaninglessness. Lena felt her breath hitch. She felt the urge to let go, to just lay down in the dust and let the silence take her. It was easy. It was safe. It was the only logical outcome. She closed her eyes, and in the dark behind her lids, she saw the fruit tart. She saw the dust on the floor. She saw the faces of the people she'd fought alongside. And then she saw the mistake. The Union hadn't mapped humanity. They had mapped themselves. They assumed that despair was a universal language. They assumed that a species, when stripped of its hope, would simply cease to function. They didn't understand the psychological architecture of a human. They didn't understand that for us, despair wasn't a death sentence, it was fuel. Lena stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she stood. She reached out and gripped Kyle's shoulder, her fingers digging in. "Kyle," she said, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. "They want us to feel useless. They want us to realize we're small." She looked at the bunker wall, at the scratches they had made to count the days, the hours, the minutes. "They wanted a soldier," she said, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying clarity that hadn't been there before. "They wanted someone who follows orders and breaks under pressure. They don't realize that they didn't just build a trap. They built a nightmare." The anchor was still humming, trying to push them down, trying to make them break. But the more the machine pushed, the more Lena's focus sharpened. It was like trying to extinguish a candle by dumping a hurricane on it. All the machine did was push the flame, and the flame spread. "They think this is our breaking point," Lena said, and she reached for her rifle. "They don't realize this is when we finally start enjoying it." The Union thought they had turned off the light. They didn't realize they had just forced humanity to see in the dark. The anchor didn't break us, it calibrated us. If you had walked into the command center in the Pacific, you wouldn't have seen desperate men and women running for their lives. You would have seen a machine, cold, precise, and entirely devoid of fear. The psychological weight of the anchor was still there, pressing down on every soul, but it was being channeled. We weren't feeling despair anymore. We were feeling clarity. The High Admiral watched his tactical map, his mandibles clicking in a rhythmic, agitated pattern. He was seeing the impossible. The human forces, fragmented and decimated hours ago, were moving in total chilling synchronicity. They weren't using encrypted channels, which he could easily jam. They were using localized, short-wave bursts that shouldn't have been able to carry a complex, coordinated attack, yet somehow they did. "They are moving towards the dreadnoughts," the advisor reported, his voice tinged with the first true note of panic. "They are not shielding. They are accelerating. They intend to collide. No, Admiral, they intend to board." It was an irrational maneuver. To board a dreadnought with atmospheric transport craft was a suicide mission. It was a tactical blunder so egregious it shouldn't even exist in a military doctrine. But the humans weren't fighting according to doctrine. They were fighting according to desperation. In the sky, Lena stood at the helm of the Vengeance, a cobbled-together transport ship that looked more like a flying junk heap than a vessel of war. Around her, 20 other ships, similarly scarred and jury-rigged with salvaged Union technology, were closing the distance. "Shield integrity is at 12%, Kyle reported from the sensor station. "They're locking onto us." "Keep the burn steady," Lena said, her voice eerily calm. She wasn't just a pilot, she was a focal point. All the rage, all the fear, all the cold, hard logic of the last 4 days was concentrated into the thrusters of that ship. "They're expecting us to peel off," Kyle said, his eyes scanning the data. "They're holding their fire to let us come closer, thinking they can capture us for further study." "Let them think it," Lena said. "We have the localized ion field generator from the port city grid. Kyle, arm it." "If we fire that inside their proximity, it'll fry our own systems," Kyle warned. "I know," Lena said, "and it'll fry theirs. We're not meant to survive the landing. We're meant to make sure they can't lift off." She looked out the viewport. The massive chrome surface of the enemy flagship, the Star Eater, loomed in front of them. a mountain of impenetrable metal. It was beautiful in its terrifying efficiency, and it was going to be their grave. "They call us weak," Lena whispered, pushing the throttle past the red line. The Vengeance screamed as its engines began to fail under the strain. "They look at our history and see only blood and stupidity. They don't see the sacrifice. They don't see that we are the only species in this sector that would trade a life for an inch of ground." "Kale, count it down." 3, 2, 1. The Vengeance didn't just fly, it punched a hole in the reality of the Admiral's perfect war. They weren't fighting a nation. They were fighting a collective, desperate, brilliant rage that had run out of other options. The collision, not of ship against ship, but of human audacity against alien arrogance, was about to change everything. The tactical shift was not subtle. The Admiral watched as the Vengeance slammed into the hull of the Star Eater. It wasn't a destructive impact. It was a pinning maneuver, and simultaneously the localized ion field generator detonated, not outside, but within the proximity of the flagship. The Admiral's bridge went dark. The hum of the anchor flickered and died. For the first time in the history of the Tri-System, the Union was truly, fundamentally alone. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a wildfire. And wildfires don't follow rules. The flagship, once a bastion of the Valerian Empire, was silent, a tomb of cold metal drifting in the void. Lena Soreth walked through the bridge, her boots echoing against the deck plating. The High Admiral sat slumped in his command chair, his eyes reflecting the flickering holographic displays of a dying armada. "You should have been easy," the Admiral whispered, his voice failing. "You are chaotic, you are short-lived, you are illogical." "That was your first mistake, Admiral," Lena replied, her voice steady, chillingly clear. "You thought logic was the only language of the universe. You thought that because you could predict the movement of stars, you could predict the movement of a heart." She stood over him, a figure of quiet, terrifying resolve. "You looked at our short lives and saw insignificance. You didn't realize that in those few fragile years, we learned to love and fight with a ferocity that species who live for millennia can't comprehend. We don't have time to be rational. We don't have the luxury of slow calculation." "We thought we were fighting a species," the Admiral said, looking up at her, finally seeing the truth. "We were fighting a collective, concentrated rage that was never meant to be unleashed." "You weren't fighting us, Admiral," Lena said, and her voice carried the weight of 1,000 years of human survival. "You were just the latest thing to threaten our sanctuary, and for that, you pay the price." The Galactic Union was fractured, its pride shattered. In the annals of history, humanity would no longer be seen as an upstart. They were now recognized for what they truly were, dormant apex predators. We aren't the strongest, we aren't the fastest, and we certainly aren't the most advanced. But we are the most dangerous thing in the multiverse because we never, ever give up. We are the stubborn, irrational, defiant heart of existence. We are the nightmare that lives in the dark, waiting for someone to get too close. Lena turned away, looking out into the vast, indifferent stars. "You call the universe a closed system of laws. You are not wrong, but you are incomplete. You believe yourselves to be the masters of everything you survey. You are wrong, because if you see a small blue planet, turn around. Because if you wake the giant, you will not live to see the dawn." For more epic HFY stories that explore the true power of humanity, make sure to like and subscribe to tell us, what do you think is humanity's greatest strength? Let us know in the comments below.